He was young, ambitious, and on the trail of a story that had gripped the world. Less than a year after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Jim Koethe, a journalist in Dallas, was found dead in his apartment. His neck had been snapped in a way police would later describe as resembling a karate chop, a detail as strange as it was brutal. The apartment had been ransacked. Some items were missing, and yet the most valuable thing might not have been money, but what he was working on, a book about the JFK assassination. In the years that followed, Koethe's death would be buried in silence and speculation. Was it a burglary gone wrong, or something far more calculated? Welcome to Bad Things. Join us as we unravel the mysterious death of Jim Koethe and examine what most likely happened. On the evening of November 24, 1963, a small group gathered in a modest apartment in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas. Just hours earlier, nightclub owner Jack Ruby had shot Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of assassinating President John F. Kennedy. The world was still reeling, and so were the reporters on the ground. Among them was Jim Koethe, a 30-year-old journalist working for the Dallas Times-Herald. That night, Koethe entered Ruby's apartment with a few others. Bill Hunter, a reporter from the Long Beach Press-Telegram, Tom Howard, an attorney representing Ruby, George Senator, Ruby's roommate, and Jim Martin, a friend of Senator's. The gathering wasn't officially sanctioned. What they did there, searching through the private living space of the man who had just murdered Oswald, wasn't strictly legal either. But it happened, and Koethe was there. What they discussed, what they found, or didn't find, remains unclear. But those who were present that night would all become footnotes in a much larger story. And for at least 3 of them, their lives would soon come to an abrupt and unusual end. Jim Koethe had been reporting in Dallas throughout the JFK assassination crisis. Like many journalists in the city, he was deeply immersed in the chaotic aftermath. But Koethe wasn't content with surface-level stories. In the months following the assassination, he began quietly collaborating with other journalists, including Bill Hunter, on a potential book that would delve into the Dallas underworld and its possible ties to the events of November 22nd. Koethe's role in the project focused on the local political scene and organized crime networks. Friends later recalled that he had become increasingly animated about the material he was uncovering. He seemed energized, convinced that deeper truths were within reach. He told colleagues he believed the official version of events wasn't the whole story. He was writing, researching, talking to sources. But then, in the fall of 1964, his voice suddenly went silent. On the morning of September 21, 1964, Koethe's body was discovered in his apartment in East Dallas. It was his landlady who made the grim find. He was lying on the floor, wrapped in a blanket. At first, there were no obvious signs of trauma. No gunshot wounds, no blood. But the autopsy told a different story. A fracture had snapped a key bone in his neck. The cause of death was asphyxiation due to blunt force trauma. More specifically, what the pathologist described as a sharp, singular impact. One law enforcement officer would later refer to it as resembling a karate chop to the throat. The blow had been delivered with enough precision and force to kill instantly. Inside the apartment, drawers were pulled out and papers strewn across the floor. Some money and valuables were missing. At first glance, it looked like a robbery, a crime of opportunity. But something was off. According to Koethe's parents, the most critical items, the notes and materials he had compiled for his assassination book, were nowhere to be found. They believed someone had specifically removed them. Whoever went through his apartment was careful to remove his research, one acquaintance later said. The Dallas Police Department launched an investigation. Within a few days, a break came. A 22-year-old ex-convict named Larry Earl Reno was arrested after he was caught attempting to sell some of Koethe's belongings: a pistol, a wristwatch, and a $50 bill. A waitress had come forward after Reno bragged about the items in a local diner. Police quickly matched the goods to the murder victim. Reno had a criminal history and had been staying with relatives in Dallas. One of them, his cousin Lena Lee, was later charged as an accessory. Investigators began piecing together what they believed was the sequence of events: a break-in, a confrontation, a sudden fatal blow. It appeared on the surface to be an open and shut case. But then something unexpected happened. When the case was presented to the Dallas County Grand Jury, District Attorney Henry Wade made a highly unorthodox move. Rather than push for an indictment, he quietly advised the jurors against it. No charges were brought against Reno for the murder. Officially, it was a no bill, a legal term meaning the grand jury declined to indict. Reno would remain in custody for unrelated crimes, and months later he was convicted of an armed robbery at a Dallas hotel and sentenced to life in prison. The charges against Lena Lee were dropped without explanation. And just like that, the investigation into Jim Koethe's death ground to a halt. Publicly, authorities stuck to the narrative that Koethe had surprised a burglar in his home and was killed in the struggle. But the decision not to prosecute the one man tied to the scene and in possession of stolen items left many uneasy. For those paying attention, an even more chilling pattern was emerging. Earlier that year, in April 1964, Bill Hunter, Koethe's colleague and fellow Ruby apartment visitor, had been killed inside the press room of a Long Beach police station. At first, police said the gun discharged accidentally. Later, one officer admitted that he and another cop had been playing a mock quick draw game when the gun went off, hitting Hunter directly in the chest. The officers were found guilty of negligence and sentenced to probation. But Hunter was dead. Another reporter gone. Then, in March 1965, Tom Howard, the lawyer who had been present during the Ruby apartment search, died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 48. Officially, it was natural causes, but close friends claimed he had been visibly anxious and on edge in the days leading up to his death. Of the 6 men known to be in Ruby's apartment that night in November 1963, 3 would be dead less than 2 years later. Despite this, the Warren Commission released its final report on September 24, 1964, just 3 days after Koethe was found dead, concluding that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in the assassination of President Kennedy, and that Jack Ruby had also acted independently in killing Oswald. The report made no mention of Jim Koethe. His name didn't appear in the footnotes. His work wasn't referenced, and his murder wasn't investigated at the federal level. The Dallas Police Department quietly closed the case. No further suspects were identified. No new leads emerged. And Koethe's unfinished manuscript was never recovered. His parents never stopped believing that he was killed for what he knew. But no one could prove it, and no one ever would. Over the years, several theories have surfaced to explain what happened to Jim Koethe. Some are grounded in criminal investigation, others rooted in political paranoia, and a few stretch into the shadowy realms of national conspiracy. Each theory paints a different picture, not only of Koethe's final moments, but of what may have led to them. Here's a breakdown of the competing possibilities. Number 1. The intelligence hit. One theory focuses less on the burglary and more on the precision of the killing itself. Supporters of this idea argue that the manner of death, a single silent bone-breaking blow to the neck, resembles techniques known to be used by trained operatives. The idea here is that Koethe became a threat to someone connected to US intelligence services. According to this line of thinking, The murder wasn't chaotic or desperate. It was clean, direct, and efficient. There's no public record that Koethe was under surveillance by the CIA or FBI. However, proponents of this theory point to broader patterns. By the mid-60s, there was already suspicion that federal agencies had been involved in some form of manipulation around the JFK assassination narrative. Ruby himself had reported contact with law enforcement and was known to have underworld ties, relationships which occasionally overlapped with intelligence work during the Cold War era. The idea isn't that Koethe was a target because of who he was, but because of what he might have found out, either during his visit to Ruby's apartment or during his investigation into Dallas's criminal and political elite. In this version of events, someone with the tools to kill quietly and make it look like a botched burglary eliminated him to prevent the publication of compromising information. Skeptics of this theory point out its reliance on speculative links. There's no record, no declassified file, no agent memo that names Jim Koethe, said author and researcher Gary S. Schoner in a 1993 interview. But what makes people look twice is the timing, the method, and the fact that his notes vanished. Number 2. A mob-ordered execution. Another school of thought proposes that organized crime was behind Koethe's death, not because of intelligence ties, but because he got too close to Jack Ruby's criminal affiliations. Ruby had connections in the Dallas and Chicago underworld, and the theory suggests that Koethe, along with fellow journalist Bill Hunter, may have been piecing together details that would expose those ties. If Koethe and Hunter had obtained sensitive names or documents during their visit to Ruby's apartment, that might have triggered a reaction from local or national mob figures. According to this theory, Koethe was silenced in much the same way mob informants have historically been dealt with. Quickly, quietly, and in a way that sent a message. Supporters often cite other high-profile mob-related deaths during this era, including Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli, who both met violent ends after being linked to investigations of the JFK assassination. Koethe's death, they argue, fits a similar mold. But here too questions arise. There's no confirmed link between Larry Earl Reno, the man found with Koethe's belongings, and any organized crime outfit. He was a drifter with no obvious connection to high-level players. It's hard to believe a guy who pawned a murder victim's watch was a mob hitman, one retired Dallas police reportedly told Ramparts magazine years later. Number 3. A local law enforcement cover-up. Then there's the theory that centers not on the killing itself, but on what happened after the crime. Specifically, why wasn't Reno charged with the murder? This line of thinking proposes that Koethe's death wasn't necessarily ordered by government agents or mob bosses, but that once it happened, and once the potential implications became clear, someone in power made the decision to quietly bury the case. District Attorney Henry Wade's private instruction to the grand jury not to indict Reno raised eyebrows, even at the time. It was a baffling decision, given that Reno had been caught with items stolen from the victim. If Koethe had unearthed material that cast city officials, police officers, or prosecutors in a compromising light, it's possible his death created a legal and political problem, one that could be more easily managed by letting the suspect go uncharged and letting the case drift quietly into obscurity. The motive here wouldn't be murder, it would be containment. As investigative journalist Penn Jones Jr. once put it, when a reporter dies with his notes missing and the DA kills the case, that's not just sloppy justice, that smells like fear. Still, there's a fundamental weakness to this theory. It assumes that Henry Wade, a high-profile prosecutor, would risk his entire career to shield either a petty criminal or a broader political secret. For some, that leap is too big. Number 4. A lone thief. Another possibility is that Larry Earl Reno acted alone, with no backing and no hidden agenda. In this theory, Reno broke into Koethe's apartment looking for money or valuables. He didn't expect anyone to be home. When Koethe confronted him, Reno panicked, perhaps striking out with a blunt object or his arm. The fatal blow to the neck was unplanned, but deadly. Afterward, Reno grabbed what he could and fled. Proponents of this explanation believe the karate chop language, widely circulated in the press, may have exaggerated the sophistication of the attack. In reality, a strong blow from a young man could produce similar injuries. Forensic analysts have pointed out that the hyoid bone and other neck structures can be fractured by sheer force. Reno's behavior in the days after the killing supports this. He showed off stolen goods at a local diner, failed to flee the city, and made no attempt to cover his tracks. It doesn't fit the profile of a calculated killer with a cleanup plan. It fits someone dumb enough or desperate enough to make reckless mistakes. Still, critics of this view point to one unresolved issue. Koethe's JFK research notes were never found. If Reno was motivated only by valuables, why take documents that were worthless to him? And why did the district attorney, with clear circumstantial evidence in hand, decline to prosecute? Number 5. Part of a pattern, or just a pattern that feels like one? There is also a more abstract theory, not about who killed Jim Koethe, but about why people believe it's more than a simple crime. In this version, the clustering of deaths, Koethe, Hunter, Howard, within a short time frame, all tied in some way to Jack Ruby, gave rise to the idea of a pattern. And once people believed there was a pattern, every unexplained death began to look like murder, and every murder began to look like conspiracy. To those who hold this view, the real culprit is coincidence and human psychology. But even that is difficult to accept when the body count feels specific, and when key materials, like Koethe's manuscript, vanish without a trace. As one former Times Herald editor said decades later, if we didn't know Jim was working on that book, maybe it wouldn't bother me so much. But we did, and then his notes were gone. And that's the part I've never been able to let go. Each of these theories offers its own version of the truth. A version shaped by motive, method, and unanswered questions. From a cold-blooded professional hit to a tragic act of chance, from state secrets to a local cover-up, the possibilities diverge wildly. But in the end, only one path leads to what most likely happened. Let's take a closer look at that next. When weighing the death of Jim Koethe, the instinct is to look outward, to see it as a tentacle of the JFK assassination saga, another mysterious link in a chain of unanswered questions. But the closer you examine the evidence, the more the story narrows. What starts as a tangle of conspiracies and speculation resolves into something simpler and sadder. At its heart, Koethe's death carries the fingerprints of a spontaneous, opportunistic act. A crime with no finesse, no exit plan, and no real mystery once the dust settles. The pieces fall into place not through intrigue, but through a series of very human missteps. Bad luck, bad timing, and bad decisions. In short, he likely interrupted a thief. The man police arrested, Larry Earl Reno, had the background, the motive, and the behavior of a small-time criminal, not a professional killer. He had no known affiliation with intelligence agencies, no mob ties, and no strategic instincts. Instead, he was seen flaunting the victim's watch and pistol within days of the killing, flashing a $50 bill at a diner waitress, seemingly unaware or unconcerned about drawing attention. For someone who had just executed a journalist in a surgically precise manner, he acted with remarkable stupidity. It's this contradiction, the perceived sophistication of the killing versus the bluntness of its aftermath, that has allowed conspiracy theories to thrive. But break it down, and the contradiction begins to dissolve. Motive is the first key. Reno had a clear one: financial gain. He was an ex-convict recently out of prison with no steady income and a record of theft. There's no evidence he knew who Jim Koethe was, much less what he was working on. That fact alone makes an intentional silencing unlikely. Had this been a planned hit, it would have required knowing Koethe's location, his schedule, his materials, and crucially identifying him as a threat. None of that appears in any records or interviews. Reno's behavior, on the other hand, suggests he was simply looking for valuables. Some argue that the missing assassination notes undermine the burglary theory. But in a real-world break-in, especially one done in a rush, thieves don't carefully curate what they take. Papers, folders, or typewritten drafts might look valuable, or might be swept up while rifling through a desk. The absence of Koethe's manuscript is unusual, yes, but it's not enough to suggest an orchestrated cover-up. A burglar who kills someone mid-theft doesn't stop to verify the content of every item he grabs. If Reno tossed the notes, burned them, or sold them for scrap, they could have disappeared forever without ever being read. Means is the next component. Much has been made of the phrase karate chop, a term used by police at the time to describe the injury that broke Koethe's neck. But that description may have been more theatrical than medical. The specific fracture involved can result from any forceful blow to the neck or a well-placed strike with the edge of the hand or arm. It doesn't require elite training or covert knowledge. A struggle between two men, one caught off guard in his home, the other panicking at the chance of being caught, could result in precisely that kind of fatal injury. What matters is that the force was focused, not that it was precise. Opportunity also points to a crime of chance. Koethe lived alone in an East Dallas apartment, a setup that made him vulnerable. Police believe the attack occurred on a Saturday night, a time when Koethe may have been relaxed or distracted. If he had just stepped out of the shower or was preparing for bed, he might not have locked the door or been alert to an intruder. Reno, familiar with the area, could have slipped in easily. Nothing about the timeline suggests premeditation. Everything about it suggests a spur-of-the-moment opportunity seized by someone who wasn't thinking clearly. That leaves one final piece: the decision not to prosecute. This is the part that most inflames suspicion, and understandably so. Reno was in possession of Koethe's stolen belongings. He had motive, proximity, and history. Yet District Attorney Henry Wade reportedly urged the grand jury not to indict. The assumption here is often that Wade was suppressing the case for some larger reason: to hide connections, to protect secrets, to shield powerful players. But the truth might be more bureaucratic than sinister. At the time, Wade was managing a city still in the global spotlight after JFK's assassination. Public trust was fragile. The Warren Commission was days away from releasing its final report. Another sensational trial, one that connected a murdered journalist to the Ruby case, even tangentially, could have opened a floodgate of renewed scrutiny. It's plausible that Wade made a calculated decision: avoid the risk of a high-profile trial with circumstantial evidence, and let Reno be dealt with through other charges. And that's exactly what happened. Reno was eventually sentenced to life in prison for an armed robbery unrelated to the Koethe case. That may be unsatisfying justice, but it's not unprecedented. Prosecutors often drop weak murder cases if they believe another conviction will keep the suspect behind bars. If the evidence against Reno, aside from possession of stolen property, was thin, Wade might have feared losing in court. The optics of a failed murder trial, tied, however loosely, to the JFK story, could have been damaging both politically and institutionally. As for the other deaths, Bill Hunter and Tom Howard, they are eerie, no doubt, but eerie doesn't mean connected. Hunter was killed in what was ruled a freak accident involving a police officer's gun. Howard, by all accounts, had been under personal and professional stress and died of a heart attack. The timing of their deaths alongside Koethe's may raise eyebrows, but so do plenty of tragic coincidences in historical crises. When major events occur, especially traumatic ones like political assassinations, the deaths and misfortunes of everyone remotely involved can begin to look like puzzle pieces. But correlation isn't causation. The theory that intelligence agencies eliminated Koethe relies heavily on assumptions, that he had uncovered damning material, that he was being monitored, that someone high up saw him as a threat. But there's no documented evidence he was on anyone's radar. No FOIA releases, no memos, no surveillance records, and most importantly, no witnesses to any of it. The theory has drama, but little grounding. Similarly, the organized crime angle assumes a level of operational coordination that doesn't align with the sloppiness of the crime. Mob hits, particularly in the 1960s, were often brutally efficient, but rarely involved suspects caught selling a victim's watch to strangers. If Koethe's murder had been a professional job ordered by mafia contacts, it likely wouldn't have left a suspect or a trail. So what remains? A burglary, a confrontation, a deadly blow, an accidental killing by a young man desperate for money, followed by a political system that decided not to dig too deeply. If there was a conspiracy, it wasn't in the killing, it was in the quiet afterward. Jim Koethe died at a crossroads of journalism, history, and chaos. But the available facts suggest that he wasn't targeted for what he knew. He was a reporter who, tragically, was home when someone came looking for something else. That doesn't make his death any less shocking, but it does make it make sense.